podcast for radicals. I'm your host, Jason Bayless. If you've been tuning in, you know we've been laying the groundwork for understanding radicalism today. In previous episodes, we explored the fundamentals of radicalism, its evolution, and the core principles driving modern movements. Today, we're building on these foundations by exploring how communities worldwide are putting three essential concepts into practice: freedom, equality, and justice. We see these principles at work when mutual aid networks ensure everyone has food and medicine, when tenant unions fight for housing as a human right, when Indigenous communities protect their lands and ways of life. While politicians and corporations may talk about freedom and equality, movements on the ground show us what these ideas really mean through their daily practices. As we face deepening inequalities, a climate emergency, and rising authoritarianism, communities aren't just theorizing, they're building alternatives. From workers creating democratic cooperatives to environmental justice movements protecting our collective future, people are demonstrating what real freedom, equality, and justice look like in action. In this episode, we'll explore how movements have transformed these concepts through their struggles, moving from individual rights to collective liberation, from legal equality to genuine social transformation, and from punitive systems to restorative approaches. Let's kick things off by talking about freedom. For many people, freedom means individual liberty, freedom from government interference, the right to speak out, and the right to make choices. This understanding of freedom came from Enlightenment thinkers who saw it as a way to challenge absolute power, like that of monarchs and the church. Liberation movements have long understood that freedom extends beyond individual rights to encompass the material conditions necessary for a dignified life. This understanding didn't come from individual theorists. It emerged from workers' struggles, enslaved revolts, and indigenous resistance to colonization. When workers organized unions despite brutal repression, when enslaved people built underground networks for survival and liberation, when indigenous peoples fought to protect their lands and ways of life. These struggles demonstrated that freedom required both breaking chains and building new forms of collective organization. 19th century movements deepened this understanding through their experiences. Worker organizations learned that winning the right to vote or form unions, while crucial victories, wasn't enough if economic conditions kept people in poverty. Former slaves and their descendants showed that legal emancipation required economic and political power to mean anything real. These lessons resonate in today's struggles. In worker cooperatives creating democratic workplaces, in tenants unions fighting evictions and building community control of housing, in mutual aid networks ensuring communities can meet their basic needs. When communities establish food cooperatives and food deserts, create land trusts for permanent affordable housing, and build networks of care outside the market system, they're putting into practice this deeper understanding of freedom that emerged from centuries of struggle. The anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon deepened this analysis with his famous declaration, "Property is theft." While defending personal possessions, Proudhon challenged the system that lets landlords profit from basic human needs. His critique lives on in today's housing justice movements, where tenants unions fight evictions and community land trusts create permanently affordable housing. For example, today's community land trusts directly embody Proudhon's vision by reclaiming land for public benefit rather than private profit. These initiatives seek to permanently remove land from speculative markets, ensuring housing is treated as a human right rather than a commodity. When activists occupy vacant buildings while people sleep on the streets, they echo Proudhon's fundamental question: who does the city truly belong to? Peter Kropotkin further developed these ideas, showing how freedom requires collective empowerment and shared resources. We see his principles at work in our own communities, when food cooperatives not only provide affordable groceries in food deserts, but create democratic workplaces and build direct relationships with local farmers. When community gardens reclaim vacant lots, they're not just growing food, but teaching collective organizing skills and challenging private property relations. These practices are not isolated actions, but part of a broader anti-capitalist resistance that challenges the commodification of essential resources and aims to create systems where community well-being takes precedence over profit. These local initiatives connect to broader movements like La Via Campesina, where millions of small farmers practice similar principles of collective resource management and democratic control. Together, they demonstrate Kropotkin's understanding that genuine freedom grows through practical experiences of cooperation and mutual aid, from neighborhood initiatives to global networks. By the 20th century, this understanding of freedom expanded even further. Black radical thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois connected freedom not only to economic conditions, but also to racial liberation. In his groundbreaking work, Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois introduced the concept of abolition democracy. This idea emerged from his study of the Civil War and its aftermath, where he saw how the formal ending of slavery, without deeper transformation, left Black Americans still unfree. Du Bois showed that genuine freedom required three interconnected forms of power: political power that went beyond just voting rights to include real community self determination, economic power through land redistribution and independent Black institutions, and educational power through control over schools and knowledge creation. When former enslaved people established their own churches, created mutual aid societies, built independent schools, and ran for political office during Reconstruction, they were putting abolition democracy into practice. Their experiments in freedom were eventually crushed by white supremacist violence and Northern capitulation, but their vision lives on. Du Bois saw these struggles as part of a global movement. As he studied anti colonial movements across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, he recognized that all these fights for freedom shared common ground. Whether it was Black Americans fighting Jim Crow, Africans resisting colonial rule, or Asian and Caribbean peoples demanding independence, each struggle revealed that true liberation requires transforming entire systems of power. This global perspective helped shape the movements that followed. The Black Panther Party combined their resistance to police violence with a broader fight for the conditions that would allow Black communities to be truly free. Their 10-point program called for full employment, decent housing, and community control over schools. Their free breakfast programs and medical clinics weren't just services, they were practical demonstrations of what freedom could look like in action. In recent decades, liberation movements have expanded this vision to include freedom from all forms of oppression: racial, gender based, economic, and environmental. For Indigenous sovereignty movements like Idle No More in Canada and the Zapatistas in Mexico, freedom isn't about individual autonomy alone. It extends beyond individual autonomy to embrace collective control over land, resources, and traditional ways of life. These movements remind us that the fight for freedom is also about reclaiming autonomy over the resources and cultural practices essential to community identity and survival, an essential element of global liberation struggles against ongoing colonial and capitalist domination. This understanding of freedom is deeply tied to community, culture, and land, a stark contrast to the narrow, individualistic notion of freedom often promoted in liberal discourse. This transformative vision moves beyond just the right to be left alone. It encompasses dismantling the systems that keep people from living full, autonomous lives while building new forms of collective organization. Freedom grows through our practical efforts to care for each other, organize democratically, and create alternatives, from neighborhood mutual aid networks to global movements for liberation. Each local initiative, each act of solidarity, each experiment in collective organizing helps us learn and practice what real freedom could mean. Now let's explore equality. In Western liberal democracies, equality is often reduced to legal rights, equality before the law. But radical movements worldwide have long understood that true equality requires dismantling the systems that create and maintain hierarchies of power, whether they're based in capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, or racism. Different cultural traditions have offered profound insights into equality. For instance, many indigenous societies practiced, and continue to practice, forms of social organization that distribute power and resources far more equitably than Western systems. These weren't utopian societies, but they often maintained more egalitarian relationships between people and with the natural world. Struggles across the globe have shaped the evolution of radical equality. In India, social reformers like Jyotirao Phule connected the fight against caste oppression with the need for economic redistribution. Phule understood that formal equality meant nothing if deep-seated social hierarchies remained intact. In China's early 20th century, Revolutionary movements challenged both traditional hierarchies and Western imperial power, seeking to reimagine social relationships from the ground up. Anti colonial movements worldwide deepened our understanding of equality by showing how economic exploitation, racial hierarchies, and colonial domination were all interconnected. As Frantz Fanon argued, decolonization wasn't just about formal independence. It required the complete transformation of society and the creation of what he called new human beings. When queer and trans activists in the global south challenge both local and imperial power structures, they're demonstrating how equality requires transforming multiple systems at once. This transformation is happening in our workplaces too. When Amazon workers organize across borders, like the ongoing collaboration between German and Polish workers to prevent the company from using one country's workforce against the other, they're showing how equality must transcend national boundaries. Their coordinated international strikes during Prime Day demonstrate that worker solidarity can challenge even the world's largest corporations. These labor struggles remind us that equality can't be confined within national borders any more than capital is. Similarly, when housing rights activists demand housing for all, they're fighting for material equality, not just equal opportunity. Many radical movements practice equality through horizontal organizing, consensus decision making, and resource sharing. For example, mutual aid networks during recent crises have demonstrated what equality looks like in practice, not charity from above, but communities supporting each other as equals. These networks show us that equality isn't just a goal for the future, it's something we can practice right now. The disability justice movement, led by activists like Mia Mingus and Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasina, challenged us to rethink what bodies are considered normal or valuable. Their rallying cry, "Nothing about us without us," demands not just formal inclusion, but genuine power in decision making. When domestic workers organize globally, they show us intersectionality in action, addressing gender, class, race, and migration status simultaneously. Their struggles remind us that we can't address one form of inequality without addressing them all. In our digital age, equality takes on new dimensions. While technology could democratize knowledge and connection, we see instead how digital divides and algorithmic bias reproduce existing inequalities. Radical tech activists are fighting for equal access to digital tools and working to build technology that serves communities rather than corporations. Environmental justice movements show us that equality must extend beyond human relationships to our relationship with the planet. When Indigenous water protectors fight pipeline projects, they're not just opposing environmental destruction. They're asserting equal rights for future generations and for the earth itself. This understanding of equality recognizes that human liberation is inseparable from ecological justice. Modern movements for economic justice show us that equality isn't about everyone having exactly the same things. It's about ensuring everyone has what they need to thrive. The Rojava Revolution in northern Syria demonstrates this through their system of democratic confederalism, where different ethnic and religious communities maintain their autonomy while participating in a larger framework of cooperative economics and shared decision making. They're not calling for uniform sameness, but for a world where diverse communities can determine their own ways of living while ensuring no one is left behind. The radical vision of equality challenges us to think beyond simple legal or political rights. It asks us to imagine and create new ways of relating to each other and organizing society. It recognizes that true equality requires transforming our economic systems, our social relationships, and our very understanding of what it means to be human. As we face growing inequality worldwide, this radical understanding becomes more crucial than ever. We're not just fighting for a slightly fairer version of the current system. We're fighting for fundamental transformation that makes genuine equality possible. Let's explore our final concept, justice. Like freedom and equality, justice looks very different depending on who defines it and who controls its institutions. Before we explore alternatives, we need to understand how current systems came to be. Today's criminal justice systems emerged directly from colonial structures of control. In the American South, police forces evolved from slave patrols, organized to capture escaped enslaved people and prevent rebellions. This wasn't unique to America. Across the colonial world, new legal systems served to protect property and control labor. The Indian Forest Act of 1927 criminalized traditional forms of communal land use, forcing communities off ancestral lands to establish colonial timber reserves. Throughout Africa, colonial powers deliberately undermined customary law systems that emphasized reconciliation and community harmony. These aren't just historical facts. These systems evolved directly into today's criminal justice institutions. The same laws that criminalized enslaved people's freedom movements became the foundation for modern policing. The property laws that displaced indigenous peoples still justify resource extraction and land grabs. Contemporary prison labor extends the colonial practice of forced labor under new names. Understanding this continuity helps us see why reform isn't enough. We need fundamentally different approaches to justice. Many communities are actively reclaiming and reviving different ways of understanding justice. Let's look deeply at two interconnected examples that show how justice relates to land, resources, and community self determination. In Southeast Asia, the Karen people maintain systems of justice that integrate social harmony with ecological balance. Their Kiu system of forest rotation ensures sustainable resource use, while their community based conflict resolution processes focus on restoring relationships rather than punishment. When faced with land grabs or resource extraction, Karen communities aren't just defending territory, they're protecting an entire system of justice that views environmental and social harmony as inseparable. This understanding that justice, land, and community are interconnected appears in movements worldwide. In Puerto Rico, farming collectives like Organización Boricua are reviving traditional agricultural practices while fighting against imposed dependency on food imports. Their work shows how food sovereignty, communities' right to control their own food systems, is inseparable from broader justice struggles. When they establish community managed farms, seed saving networks, and local markets, they're not just growing food, they're rebuilding systems of justice that colonial powers tried to destroy. These movements demonstrate a crucial point. Justice isn't just about how we respond to harm after it happens. It's about creating conditions where communities can maintain balanced relationships with each other, with the land, and with their cultural practices. This understanding helps us see how other justice movements are interconnected. When sex worker organizations like Empower Foundation challenge both Western imposed anti trafficking laws and traditional stigma, they're fighting for the right to define justice on their own terms. Their emphasis on collective organizing and mutual support shows how worker justice grows from community self determination. When urban communities resist displacement, they're not just fighting for housing, they're asserting their right to shape justice in their neighborhoods. The Urban Poor Alliance in Manila demonstrates this by developing community led planning approaches that prioritize collective needs over profit. These movements show us that justice isn't something that can be imposed from above or contained within courtrooms. Real justice grows from communities having the power to maintain balanced relationships, resolve conflicts, and meet collective needs. It requires transforming our relationships with each other, with the earth, and with the systems that govern our lives. Most importantly, these examples remind us that building justice isn't something that happens somewhere else. It happens wherever communities come together to address harm, meet needs, and create new ways of living together. Whether we're supporting community conflict resolution, building mutual aid networks, or fighting for environmental protection, we're all part of this broader movement to transform what justice means and how it works. We've spent this episode exploring how radical movements understand and fight for freedom, equality, and justice. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're living ideas that guide struggles for liberation around the world. From communities reclaiming their traditional practices to movements creating new forms of organizing, we see how these fundamental ideas continue to evolve and inspire action. Thank you for joining us for episode 4 of A Podcast for Radicals. If you found today's exploration of radical perspectives valuable, please subscribe and share this podcast with others who might be interested in these conversations. This podcast is part of a Guide for Radical series, and your support helps us continue creating these episodes. You can join our community at aradicalguide.com, where we're building connections between movements and sharing resources for radical organizing. If you appreciate this work, consider making a tax-deductible donation to support our efforts. Your contributions help us create more educational resources and strengthen networks of solidarity. Until next time, remember, follow ideas, not people.